Hi, I'm Eric, and today I'm going to be presenting my response to the Podblogger brief. So this brief is really about creating a platform that has three main focuses: catering to situations where audio is preferred medium, responding to the increase in smart speakers and personal assistants, and creating an ear to a world of ideas, enabling people to share knowledge that will make the world a better place. And I think I see these first two as the ways that we remain relevant to the way our users interact with content. But this third is really where we stand to have a chance of standing out from the rest of the products available within the current landscape. And let's look at some of those products. And one of the themes that we will immediately see is this idea of the paradox of choice. This was a term coined by psychologist Barry Schwartz in 2004, but it's increasingly relevant today. And that's the idea that more choice leads to paralysis, not freedom. And you can see here an example user flow from Spotify where I go into podcast and click on the first category. That leads me to a choice of different charts, then a choice of different podcasts, then a choice of different episodes before I can finally hit play. It's just overwhelming, countless choices at each step. And even if I trim that down to just podcasts and episodes, there's still millions of choices to choose from. So maybe we need more constraints, not more choices. And at the same time that we're connected to all this content, we're disconnected and distant in another way. Most of these major platforms like Spotify and Google and Apple are one-way communication. You can press play and that's about it. There's no comments, no sense of community, no way for creators, audiences, and other creators to really build a conversation together. And with more Australians feeling lonely now than really ever before, there's an opportunity to step back and reconnect people. And speaking of people, let's look at some of those personas that this platform is really trying to reach. So first persona we have here is Selena, and she's a 21-year-old student who's a devout podcast listener. She averages 7 podcasts a week, like 80% of podcast listeners, and loves discovering new ones. She's looking for ways to find new unique content and mainly listens at home, where 49% of overall podcast listening is done. Now, contrast that with Jane, who's 39 years old. She's a local NGO organizer in the community. She's a casual listener in terms of podcasts, and she's not really looking for podcasts per se, but rather she's looking for ways to communicate and really understand what's going on in the community and contribute her voice to the conversation. And that's where we believe audio is a medium that can really allow her to do so. And so we take these personas that really represent pillars of audio and discovery, as well as community and social, and we combine that with these themes of constraints. And that leads us to this ideation process. So we start with inspiration from TikTok, from Twitter, sorry, and Yik Yak, and the in-person constraints they use, as well as ideas of community from pirate radio. We bring that into mashups, brainstorming, and sketches, and we arrive at this idea of pods, which is a community-based system where your geographical area is your pod, and you can only discover new content through listening to content in your pod, being sent a link from someone else, or by visiting someone else's pod and really sort of swapping shoes with them and immersing yourself into their position. And what we're going to be looking at within this concept of pods is two main aspects. One is audio activities, finding and listening to content in your pod, and social activities, visiting, saving, and listening in other pods. So for this audio side of things, we started with a user journey that was relatively linear in terms of progressive satisfaction, with a slight dip at the start as consumers maybe get used to the whole concept of pods. But we believe that the innovations here, such as, for instance, having recommendations that you can go straight into, as well as organizing podcasts into rather than broad categories, specific trending topics that relate to your actual community and are really relevant to you. We think these will really resonate with the users here. And the user flow offers a lot of flexibility in reaching those same tasks, but allow you to sort of play with the interface the way that you actually prefer. And you can see that represented in this iteration here, where you have that map and list views available before going into topics and being able to play directly, or going then deeper into an episode before deciding to play that podcast. So for the social activities, the user journey is linear like the other one. It's a relatively straightforward process, and provided everything works accordingly and meets the user's expectations. The user flow is similarly more linear than the audio listening flow, as you move through friends profile, and then swap into the pod and either play directly or go into a topic as before. And that's represented here, where you have the flexibility of directly clicking an icon that will lead you into their pod, or going into the profile and having other options there before deciding to then swap pods and listen to an audio there. Now, after having these first iterations, I took a step back and sort of analyzed this. And I think the biggest consideration that I realized was there was a lack of accessibility in considering the extremes. This might work for these super personas that were created, but what if I live in an area without an active user base yet? Or what if I don't have friends on this platform to swap pods with? And I'm really just limited in terms of what I can actually listen to and explore. And its social functionality needs to be accessible for all users, or the issue of that social disconnectedness that really was a core theme at the start won't be properly addressed. So with that in mind, I then introduced the idea of the podverse and random pods. So the podverse acts as a hub into your own pods as well as other pods, and also includes a random pod button, which is a nice little sort of gamified way almost of giving every user access to a diverse range of content while still maintaining that idea of exploration and the community feel of the concept. You never quite know what you're going to get. And then as well as that, to complement that, there's also saved pods where you can check back in on pods you find interesting, um, as well as design changes overall, such as adding in color and colored prompts to really encourage participation and highlight what the key affordances are on each screen. So after that self-analysis came time to actually test these prototypes of users. And it was important not just to test those first two tasks concerning your pod and friends pod, but also that new idea of the random pod, because it's important that all of these different sort of pod interactions remain consistent throughout the platform. Now with this first user, that first task of navigating to your pod, selecting topic and playing audio was relatively straightforward. But when it came to interacting with random pods and different pods, especially at the start, there was a lot more confusion around the concept of the podverse and different pods. And it's particularly a task 2 ended up taking him 4 minutes to complete. So with that in mind, I made a few improvements to the prototype before testing it with further users. I firstly made the podverse now landing screen, as this along with its icon were the most distinct, and doing so allowed it to better convey the overall metaphor. I made save pods more clear of importance through color. I simplified the friend screen layout through removing the icons and simplifying that process. And I swapped the swap pods metaphor into visit pods. I just better illustrated what it actually felt like. I also added placeholder text to differentiate pods and content and to create a more better realistic representation of what the actual product will look like. So these changes were overall really quite well received by the remaining 4 users I tested with average time to completion and average errors dropping dramatically. But there was still some issues, namely, although the podverse landing screen helped convey the metaphor, it not being the central home made it a bit confusing for users. And there was also some difficulty finding buttons such as add to save pods. I then compounded on these results with my own self-analysis using Nielsen's heuristics. So I found the biggest issue to be in terms of consistency and standards, because your pod and friends and other pods differed in both functionality and appearance, but neither of these layouts were also really optimal, with the abundance of elements at first potentially overwhelming for users. And so it was important going forwards to keep the flexibility and functionality, but maintain a more minimalist design. So based on that, I went into this final iteration with a different design approach and user flow. I'm aiming to create a more cohesive experience centered around that central podverse, and then having consistent experiences for your pod, friend pod, and random pods. Now, going to this final iteration, we open on a podverse, which is now clearly the home screen, and there's also a lot more consistent color language with orange for main affordances and blue for social affordances such as save pods and friends. Going to your pod, we can see the interface is now a lot simpler, but still maintaining that functionality and flexibility from before. Going to a topic, we can see the bottom cards of forward scrolling, or we can also interact directly with the map and either preview or click directly into a pod and either play an audio directly or go into an audio screen and then play it. This experience is also the same for random pods, with the exception of being able to add them to save pods and get feedback. And the simple design also makes this more prominent. And again, it's also the same for friends, because this is now a much more consistent experience overall, proven by the positive reception from the first users retesting and the much improved test results. So in accordance with situations where voice commands or personal assistants might be preferable, it's important to have concurrent voice journeys that are consistent with the touch journeys you just saw. So I'm going to have a brief preview here, but there's also a full demo available if you want.
Okay, Google, what's new on my pod today?
Here's a new recommendation for you in your pod. Tony posted a new audio called Tony Reviews Willies. Here's a preview.
These cookies are absolutely insane. And when you mix them with a mud cake.
Let me know if you want to hear more.
So in conclusion, I responded to this brief by reimagining the way we interacted with and explored audio, hopefully putting the pod in Podblogger and acting as an ear to every individual's world and the world of others, making a collective world a better place. Thanks.